We're going to start chapter 8 this week on Friday. So get chapter 8. We're going back to chapter 8. Chapter 8 should be read for Friday's class. We're going to spend Friday and all of next week on chapter 8. So we skipped chapter 8. We went 7, 9, 10, and then we're going back to 8. All right, so chapter 8 for Friday. Today we're going to focus on the Indian Removal Act, a dark chapter in American history. A dark chapter in American history. And we're going to take a peek at the specifics. We talked briefly about it last week, an overview. Today's lesson will kind of focus entirely on that topic. Again, we're talking about Jackson's presidency, and we said that Jackson really was not a friend to Native American groups, and he certainly wasn't a friend to African Americans as well. Indian Removal Act, passed by Congress in 1830, and it authorized relocation of Eastern Native American tribes. So when we talk about Eastern Native American tribes, we're talking about largely tribes from the American Southeast. The American Southeast. And the U.S. government was hoping to acquire Native American territories. That is what's precipitating the Indian Removal Act, to make way for American settlers, to make way for American farmers, to make way for Americans who want to settle on what are established, tried, and true Native American lands. The Indian Removal Act is going to force them to move west of the Mississippi River, and most of the concentration is going to be moving west to what today would be the Oklahoma Territory. So we're talking about a venture from the American Southeast to the central portion of the country in what today is Oklahoma. This movement is painted by the government as a way for Native Americans to have their own territory apart from American settlers, apart from people who are looking to settle on this land. And it will follow a pattern of basically Native Americans being told to move, being asked to move to new territory or protected territory, and then eventually, invariably, what will happen, they'll settle in that territory, and then at some point in the future, the same expectation will be placed on them. This time they'll be told to move somewhere else. Let's take a peek at our author's video on the Indian Removal Act.
Prior to becoming president, Andrew Jackson established his national reputation primarily as an Indian fighter. He had been a general leading wars against the Indians in Alabama and Tennessee and Mississippi. And once he became president, he was very sympathetic to the appeals of many whites as the American population grew, who wanted to spread into ancestral Indian lands in what was then called the Old Southwest. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. In order to do that, Jackson approved what was called the Indian Removal Act, whereby Congress in 1830 declared that the Indians living in that region of the nation, as well as the rest of the western frontier, were to be relocated to reservations west of the Mississippi River in what is now Oklahoma. It was an incredibly controversial.
Who can tell me where the phrase reservation comes from? What is the term? Indians are going to be forced to go onto reservations. What Lizzie said. The lands have been, quote unquote, reserved for Native Americans. And that's where the term reservation comes from, lands that have been reserved.
Decision, people criticized it, but it still happened. And federal troops forced Native Americans to pick up their belongings and begin walking hundreds of miles west. This walk was often called the Trail of Tears because many thousands of Native Americans, men, women, and children, died along the way. but it symbolized Andrew Jackson's determination to avoid continuing wars with the Native Americans by removing them and thereby allowing whites to move into those lands and take possession of them.
So the author makes an important point. This was not just done to make way for American settlers, although that is part of the reason. It's also done to ensure that if settlers and Native Americans would come into conflict over lands, what usually was going to result? Expensive wars. And Jackson did not want the country to have to pay expensive wars to defend American settlers against Native Americans. So to prevent that from happening, forced Native Americans to move west across the continent. And that's exactly what will happen with the term the Trail of Tears, which we'll get to in a moment. Native Americans, lands. Okay, let's look at some background. Here's the tragedy with all this. Native American tribes occupied lands literally for thousands of years, not just in the southeast, but across the continent. Okay, there's going to be growing pressure from white settlers to acquire more land, and the government is going to seek to acquire Native American territories. Again, we're starting to see, by 1830, the development of this idea that America was destined to go from sea to shining sea. What do we call that idea, that America is destined to settle land from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast and everything in between? It is a uniquely American term, okay? The idea that America was destined to settle land from east coast of the Atlantic to the west coast of the Pacific. Anybody know what that phrase is called? Tell me if this helps. Manifest destiny. The idea that America was destined to settle east coast to the west coast and everything in between. Manifest destiny. And the term manifest there quite simply means obvious. Destiny is what you're supposed to have happen. So manifest destiny is this belief that Americans should settle the entire continent. And not just settle, but establish American culture, establish American way of life, establish American values. American religion was a big component of manifest destiny. Okay, America spreading their religion across the continent. But the important thing to realize, ladies and gentlemen, is that, or should we, ladies and gentlemen, today we only have one, all right? The whole continent had been occupied for literally thousands and thousands of years by Native Americans, long before Europeans arrived. So not only are these people being asked to pack up or being told to pack up and leave, but they're leaving behind lands that they had lived on literally for hundreds of generations. And on a promise that if they just go a little bit farther west, that everything eventually will be okay. And that usually was not going to be the case. All right, that usually will not be the case. Jackson's role in this. Jackson, as we noted, and again, this is a lot of review, but Jackson, as we noted, was a strong supporter of Indian removal. He believed it would solve conflicts between tribes in the states. Jackson believed that this would prevent, mitigate warfare with Native American tribes as Americans settled. Also, I want to just talk about point 3 for a moment, this point here. Jackson is going to argue that, almost like a fatherly figure, that white Americans knew exactly what was best for Native Americans. And he said that placing Native Americans on reservations was for their own good. That's how he couched it in terms of describing it to Native Americans. We're going to do this for you. We're not kicking you off your land. We're going to put you in a place where you're going to be much better off. In very condescending and not very sincere fatherly advice toward the Native Americans, he argued that it was for their own good. Very condescending in the sense that, imagine a guy, an American president, telling a whole group of Native Americans that who have literally been there for thousands and thousands of years that we know what's best for you. All right. Do you think Jackson's motivations were sincere or self-serving? I think the question there. I think Jackson believed that. I think Jackson truly believed that he was acting in the best interest of Native Americans, but I think also the more important part of this is that Jackson had to get Native Americans off their lands if Americans were going to continue their march west and south across the continent. There was no question, and by the way, this area here that they're being pushed off of is going to include lots of fertile farmland, lots of fertile soil for farmers. The United States wants to capture that and get their hands on it to satisfy the growing population of people who are arriving in the United States at this point. So Jackson clearly, wants to get the Native Americans off of their lands and argued that it was going to be for their own good. Okay. A lot of that I think a lot of that would emanate probably from attitudes that Native Americans were savages. That Native Americans, there's no way they could know what was in their own best interest. So fatherly, grandfatherly white men had to make that determination for them. That was the attitude that many Americans had toward Native Americans, that they had to, because they were primitive, because a lot of Native Americans, most Native American tribes worshipped multiple gods and were not Christian, there was an attitude that Native Americans were savages and that there's no way that they could know what was best for them. So they had to have the kindness and the benevolence of white democratic figures to determine what was in their best interest. And Jackson filled that role. Jackson clearly wanted the Native Americans gone, but he presented it in a term, it's kind of like a parent who, a parent is telling you all the good reasons why you need to take your medicine. Oh, it doesn't taste that bad. Oh, it'll go down quickly. Oh, it's, if you're about to get a shot, I remember when my children were getting shots when they were toddlers. Oh, this is not going to hurt. It's going to be good for you. It's not going to hurt. And then lo and behold, like for the next 2 hours, they're screaming at the top of their lungs. There's no way that what I was telling them was helping to relieve their pain, but I told them that because it's what I felt they wanted to hear. Yeah, so I think Jackson, in the same light, is telling Native Americans what he thinks they want to hear, knowing full well that this was more about America expanding than it was about preserving and giving Native Americans a place where they could live and exist. All right? So Jackson, not a friend of Native Americans, and the Indian Removal Act is a large part of that, to provide evidence of that. Cherokee resistance. Now, this is important. All right? This is very important. Cherokees are going to put up a legal fight. And 2 cases are going to hit the Supreme Court. Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831, and Worcester v. Georgia in 1832. Now, we hinted last week that the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokee sovereignty. In other words, the Supreme Court said that the Cherokees do not have to be forced off their land. The Cherokee have every right to stay on their land, and they are every bit as American as settlers who are looking to take control of that land. But you'll note from last week, the Supreme Court deciding that was not the final word. Who had the final word on that? Jackson, who violated the Constitution by saying what, Lizzie? Correct. Jackson told John Marshall that if that's his decision, Justice Marshall, you go ahead and enforce it. I'm not going to enforce it as the president, and that's exactly Jackson's reaction. And this reaction of Jackson's basically established the power of the president during his presidency as kind of rocked that balance of power between the 3 branches that had existed for the first half of the first 25 years of the 19th century. Jackson kind of steered presidential power more toward the executive branch with this decision to ignore the Supreme Court ruling in Worcester v. Georgia. I've got a video on Worcester v. Georgia that I want to show you guys next. The landmark case, okay, when we talk about landmark cases, we're talking about significant cases that you will absolutely need to be familiar with. Worcester versus Georgia, 1832. Chief Justice John Marshall of the Supreme Court, that was his decision. It declared Georgia's laws over Cherokee land unconstitutional. It said Georgia has no right to expel the Cherokees from their land. Georgia has no right to expel the Cherokees. And it basically said that the tribal sovereignty, or the ability of the Cherokee people to rule themselves, was entirely within their rights. Okay, so the Supreme Court not only said that the laws of Georgia were unconstitutional, but it said the Cherokees have every right to provide the rule for themselves. The decision is going to be very, very important because it will side with the Cherokees, but Jackson, as we pointed out, will basically have his last word on that by saying he will ignore the decision of the Supreme Court. Let's look at Worcester v. Georgia before we leave for today. Worcester v. Georgia.
Georgia, the 1820s. The Cherokee Nation, which held territory within Georgia's borders, as well as in North Carolina, Alabama, and Tennessee, is threatened by the increasing amount of Americans who were trespassing and wanting to straight up take over their land. Georgia Governor George Gilmer, as well as most of the Georgia legislature, made it very clear they wanted the Cherokee out of the state. In 1827, the Cherokee Nation formally established a constitutional government and declared themselves sovereign, meaning American laws didn't apply to them. This, of course, angered Governor Gilmer and the legislature, and they annexed all Cherokee land in the state, dismantled the Cherokee government, and redistributed much of their land to white citizens. Not only that, but 3 years later, Congress passed and President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which gave the president the power to negotiate treaties to remove Native Americans from their lands. While all of this was going on, white missionaries were working with the Cherokee Nation to help them defend their sovereignty and continue to resist the Georgia laws that were kicking them off their own land. The Georgia legislature didn't like this so much, so they passed a law that specifically banned, quote, white persons from living with the Cherokee without special permission from the state. But several of these missionaries were rebels, you could say. They refused to leave. Two of them who refused to leave were Eliza Butler, a doctor from Connecticut, and Samuel Wooster, a minister from Vermont. Local authorities arrested Butler and Wooster for, quote, residing within the limits of the Cherokee Nation without a license and, quote, without having taken the oath to support and defend the Constitution and laws of the state of Georgia. They were convicted and sentenced to hard labor for 4 years as punishment. Wooster and Butler appealed the decision with the help of lawyers paid for by the Cherokee Nation, and their case ended up going to the Supreme Court. The court heard arguments in February 1832. Wooster and Butler's main argument was that the government of Georgia, by making laws that allowed it to force the Cherokee Nation to do whatever it said, was unconstitutional because only Congress could make treaties and deals with Indian tribes. On March 3rd, 1832, the Supreme Court announced it had sided with Wooster and Butler, voting 5-1 in their favor. Chief Justice John Marshall, aka Lil John, delivered the opinion. He argued that Georgia law was unconstitutional and got in the way of the federal government's authority. He said, quote, the Cherokee Nation, then, is a distinct community occupying its own territory in which the laws of Georgia can have no force. The whole intercourse between the United States and this nation is, by our Constitution and laws, vested in the government of the United States, unquote. In other words, he recognized the Cherokee as an independent nation. Georgia couldn't pass laws controlling Spain or France, so why could they pass laws controlling the Cherokee? So what did Georgia do in response to this decision? They ignored it, and Wooster and Butler stayed imprisoned. And President Andrew Jackson didn't force Georgia to follow the Supreme Court decision, and instead said the Cherokee Nation better get out of Georgia or fall in line with Georgia laws. Eventually, Wooster and Butler were freed from prison only after they promised to stop helping the Cherokee resist the Georgia laws. In 1835, a faction of Cherokees broke away and secretly signed the Treaty of New Achota, which gave up Cherokee lands in Georgia in exchange for money. This group claimed to be representing all of the Cherokee, but they were not. In 1838, the U.S. Army forced almost all remaining Cherokees off of their lands in Georgia and marched them to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. This was a horrible journey known as the Trail of Tears that resulted in the deaths of thousands of Cherokee along the way. So, yeah, kind of a sad ending. Wooster v. Georgia, however, was still an incredibly important Supreme Court case because it clarified the relationships Native American tribes had with both state governments and the federal government. It strengthened tribal sovereignty in the United States. Basically, the court argued that even though they reside within the borders of the United States, Native American tribes govern themselves and can have their own laws. Too bad Andrew Jackson didn't pay attention to him.
And that's exactly what happened. Jackson ignored the Supreme Court's decision. The Trail of Tears ended up occurring in 1838. The last group of Native Americans were forced at gunpoint and by soldiers on horseback in the middle of winter to march across the country over 1,000 miles from the southeast into the Oklahoma Territory. Thousands died on the way. The very young and the very old. Thousands made it, but it destroyed the life of Native American tribes from the American Southeast. Last slide, let's just take a look today at Jackson's defiance. Ignored the Supreme Court's ruling, and with his famous quote, he said, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Jackson was effectively saying that I am going to disobey, I am not going to abide by this decision. They proceeded with the forced removal of Native Americans. They gave them, actually, real quick, they gave Native Americans a deadline. They gave them a deadline in 1836, and they said you need to be out by a certain date in 1838 voluntarily. It was called voluntary removal. Makes a lot of sense, voluntary removal. If anybody remained, those are the people that are going to be forced to leave in 1838, and they were eventually forced off in what will become the Trail of Tears. We'll finish this topic up tomorrow, and we will continue on with chapter 10. Remember, have chapter 8 of your book read for what day? Friday this week. No quiz this week, no inquisitive, but you do have an inquisitive due today for chapter 10. Chapter we're working on now. Okay? Thank you. You guys can get out of your section.